Francisco Balbi, The Great Siege of Malta, Chapter 2. Grand Master La Valette looks to the defence of the island. The preparations for so great an expedition did not fail to come to the notice of the rulers of Christendom. Both through Venetian agents and those of the Grand Master, they were kept well posted as to events. His Holiness, Pope Pius IV, and His Catholic Majesty, Don Philip, King of Spain, were in their turn kept informed by the Grand Master, for it was to them that he must look for assistance if need be. La Valette did not fail to remind the Pope that he was the vicar on earth of our Lord Jesus Christ, and Don Philip that he held the special title of His Catholic Majesty. He reminded the king also how important it was for his kingdoms of Naples, Sicily, and the Mediterranean islands, and for his frontiers in Africa, that Malta should not be taken. When His Majesty knew for certain that the Sultan was preparing this armada, he appointed Don Garcia de Toledo as Viceroy of Sicily and Captain General of the Mediterranean Sea, and ordered him to make all necessary provisions for resisting the enemy and for dispatching help as necessary. In February 1565, Don Garcia arrived in Italy. Acting on the king's instructions, he held a conference with the Duke of Savoy, the Council of the Republic of Genoa, the Duke of Florence, the Pope, and the Viceroy of Naples. After this, he sailed for Sicily to take up his duties and was received with great enthusiasm. A few days later, having made arrangements for the government of Sicily to be carried on in his absence, he sailed for Malta and Gozo with 3,000 Spanish troops and 30 galleys. Don Garcia stayed a day and a half in Malta conferring with the Grand Master, visiting fortifications and giving his advice. He offered to leave some of his troops in Malta, but the Grand Master said that until the enemy's intentions were better known, his own forces would be adequate. He did, however, accept the Viceroy's offer to send an immediate relief force should it be required. Don Garcia sailed from Malta to Gozo, where he left what he considered were sufficient troops for its defence should it be attacked. These consisted of 4 companies of Spanish infantry. He then returned to Sicily to make ready for anything that might befall. When the news of the Sultan's preparations became known to the Grand Master, he immediately looked to the defence of the island, adding to the fortifications as far as he was able. The Ravelin and the Cavalier of Fort St. Michael were very weak, so nearly all the slaves, as well as the Maltese inhabitants of Birgu, the villagers, the servants of the knights, and the soldiers of the galleys, and the officers of Birgu worked incessantly to strengthen them. At the same time, the Ravelin of Fort St. Elmo was reinforced by an outer parapet of gabions and earth. Many of the houses of the district outside Birgu, which is known as Bormla, were demolished. These stood near the post of Aragon and near St. Michael. The Grand Master now summoned the knights who were in Italy. As a result of his forethought and preparations, Malta was now well prepared for the threatened invasion. On the 7th of May, the Grand Master ordered Don Francisco de Sanaguera to take out his galley, St. Gabriel, and put in position the iron chain in place across the harbour mouth. Despite its great weight, the work was carried out so efficiently that it was in position by the 8th of May. The same day, while Don Francisco de Sanaguera was aboard his galley in the Marsamachetto harbour, and his men were working on the Ravelin of St. Elmo, a friendly Moor, whose wife and son were living in Malta, arrived from the North African coast, whither he had been sent as a spy by the Grand Master. He said that Amida, Bey of Tunis, had prepared a great store of provisions for the Turkish fleet, consisting of raisins, dates, honey, oil, and other things, but there was no bread, since this was not available on the Barbary coast that year on account of the poor harvest. He reported also that Dragut, in order to secure the help of the Bey of Tunis, had sent him a present of many pieces of silk, as well as some small pieces of bronze artillery. The news that the Turkish fleet was at Modon was confirmed in Malta on the 10th of May, when Don Juan de Cardona, Captain General of the Sicilian galleys, arrived. Don Juan came with 2 galleys bringing the troops of Captain Andres de Miranda, which were commanded during the captain's absence by his lieutenant, Medrano, a very able young man of 30. Later on, Don Juan de Cardona came back again from Palermo, where he disembarked 6 companies of Spanish infantry. When he left Malta, he sailed all around the island taking soundings in the bays, and made a complete survey as he had been ordered. He carried this out with the same efficiency as he always attended to his king's instructions. 3 days after this, 2 galleys of the order landed another company of Spanish soldiers. They were commanded by Juan de la Cerda, and the Grand Master dispatched them to the garrison of St. Elmo, where they at once set to work on the Ravelin. Captain Fantone now arrived in another ship of the order together with 150 soldiers. These were sent by Rafael Crescino, the receiver of the order at Messina, together with ammunition, all at his own expense. Meantime, in Naples, Commander Gil d'Andrada had arranged for Giorgio Vercelli, the receiver of the order in that city, to enlist 200 infantrymen who he would put under the command of Hasdrubal de' Medici. Gil d'Andrada had them sent in the king's galleys to Sicily, whence they were transshipped to Malta in the galleys belonging to the order. Seeing that it was from Messina that he would look for relief, the Grand Master realised how important it was to have a man of authority in that city to deal with the order's affairs. He chose Signorino Gattinara, Prior of Messina, for this post, and gave him command of the relief force that was being assembled. He also gave him full authority to deal with all the order's affairs, and authority to borrow whatever money might be required. The Grand Master's own galley had brought 400 soldiers from Trapani to Malta under the command of Colonel Mass, together with a good store of wheat and baskets for transporting earth. The Grand Master now ordered 2 knights, Luigi Balbiano and Adrian Maimon, to get all the inhabitants and their cattle within the fortifications. All this time, the galleys of the order went back and forth between Malta and Sicily. On the outward voyage, they took with them those who were useless for the defence of the island, and on the return voyage they brought back provisions. Any ships they met within the channel which had cargoes of wheat, wine, or other foodstuffs, they brought back with them to Malta, where they were well paid for their provisions. As for the Maltese who were sent to Sicily, Don Garcia had given orders that the Sicilians should look after them and treat them as good neighbours. Pierre de Joux, the French knight who was general of the galleys and a devoted servant of the order, was at this time on his way to the island from Messina. He met a ship at Reggio with a cargo of wheat, whose Genoese captain Geronimo Villavecchia willingly sailed to Malta. Together with his men, he served with honour right through the siege. When everything was ready, the galleys brought over from Cape Passaro cargoes of fascines for the fortifications of St. Michael and St. Elmo. Finally, Commander Romgar, with the 2 galleys belonging to the Grand Master, brought down to Malta 3 small ships laden with wheat. Their arrival was hailed with great joy because, there being a shortage in Sicily, Don Garcia was not able to supply the Grand Master with all the grain he needed. As the time for the invasion grew near, the Grand Master reviewed such forces as he had available. The following are their numbers: 500 knights of all the longs, 400 Spaniards under the command of Miranda and Juan de la Cerda, 200 Italians under the command of Hasdrubal de' Medici, 400 Italians under Colonel Mass, 200 Italians under Della Motte, 100 soldiers of the garrison of St. Elmo, 500 soldiers of the galleys, 100 servants of the Grand Master and of the Knights, 200 Greeks and Sicilian residents in Malta, 500 galley slaves and mercenary oarsmen, 3,000 Maltese out of the whole island. The men, women and children of the island were available for labour, together with 1,000 slaves of the order and a great many beasts of burden. There were 3 royal magistrates, Geronimo de Huit of the Spanish long, Balthazar Emperador of the Italian long, and Antoine de Born of the French long. Apart from their judicial duties, they were in charge of the provisions and kept a muster of the labour force. They were also responsible for seeing that water was continually drawn from the Marsa to keep the cisterns of Birgu, St. Michael and St. Angelo always full. The water rationing was entrusted to Commander Antonio Pacheco Caravio and the knight Marco Antonio Altavia. When the Turkish fleet was approaching the island, the Grand Master called his council. The dispositions were made so that each long should go to his post, as is the order's custom in time of danger, to man the defences and stand to arms. Between the fortress of St. Angelo and the post of England, there were two other posts. One was the prison, where the slaves were kept. This was in the sole charge of the governor and his assistants, but it was more essential to keep a guard over the slaves than to defend this post, for it was an extremely strong one, with two reinforced guns commanding the mouth of the harbour. Between St. Angelo and this prison, a fortification was prepared for the defence of the harbour. It consisted of two heavy and two small guns mounted on a platform. This position was manned by Commander Romgar and the crew of his galley, and it proved most successful against the enemy when they were engaged in the siege of St. Elmo, as well as during the attacks on the bastion of Castile. This post, which became known as the Hub, needed few men to man it since it too was very strong. Its defenders were therefore available as reinforcements elsewhere in emergencies, as well as acting as bodyguard to the Grand Master. Below the hub, and the rock on which St. Angelo is built, at the very tip of the peninsula beneath the castle, there was a platform just above sea level. This had a number of gun ports and commanded the entrance to the Grand Harbour, as well as covering the chain which sealed off the entrance. The post was assigned by the Grand Master to Commander Francisco de Guaral, who, in company with his lieutenant Barrientos and the men of his galley, St. John, fortified it very well. He had a deep communication trench cut so that he and his men could enter the position without attracting the fire from the Turkish guns mounted on St. Elmo and the Mandra. There is no doubt that this gun position saved the island, for without it, as you shall hear, we should certainly have lost Malta. The governor of St. Angelo was Galceran Ross, a Catalan knight, while Juan de Acuna was in charge of a reserve party of 50 men from the galleys. The conventual conservator was Juan Cortés, a Catalan, while Raymond Fortuyn, a most able executive, was in charge of the treasury. He was a Mallorcan, as was also Gabriel Serralta, a pious and dedicated knight who was head of the hospital. Commander Antonio Flota della Rocha had charge of the ammunition, Commander Pugil of the artillery, while Commander Maimon, a Catalan, together with a Genoese knight, Salvago, looked after the gunpowder factory. They maintained the old stock of powder, as well as manufacturing 900 weight of new powder every day. St. Michael, which was the post of Italy, was commanded by the Admiral of the Order and held by the Italian Knights. The Admiral's command covered the whole of the peninsula of St. Michael, which was divided, on the Grand Master's orders, into separate posts under the Knights, who were captains of the galleys. The Admiral's headquarters were in front of the tower, while the Knights were stationed in houses near their individual posts. Inside the tower, which was guarded by the Knights, was a very large water cistern, as well as a good stock of ammunition. The Maltese defended a position from the water point, near the post of Aragon, up to the gate which opens on the trench. From this gate, up to the platform and the casemates, which guard the post of Aragon, lay the command of Hasdrubal de Medici, assisted by a Florentine called Antonio Martello. At the extreme end of the peninsula of St. Michael there is a defence work called the Spur. Despite its importance, it was not at all strong, being rather low, without a parapet or platform. The other end of the great chain which closed the harbour was secured to it. Francisco de Sanaguera, captain of the galley St. Gabriel, a knight from Valencia, was in charge of this post. He was a small man, but of great courage and experience, and above all, a very good Christian devoted to the order. Don Jaime de Sanaguera, his nephew, and a young man of great determination, was his lieutenant. The Spur was fortified by Don Francisco and the crew of his galley as well as they could in the time available. Ably assisted by Vincenzo Segala, clerk of his galley, Nicolas Rodio, another clerk, Peri Juan Mendoza, a Catalan brother, and Lorenzo Puche of Mallorca, he had a parapet and a fighting platform constructed, using 4 caissons of earth to achieve his purpose. They not only occupied themselves with this fortification, but took part in the fighting all around it. The ancient capital of Malta, Medina, was governed by Commander Pedro Mesquita, a Portuguese. He was also in charge of all the rest of the island. The old city was reinforced on the Grand Master's orders by 6 knights and 150 soldiers led by Juan Vanyan. The governor of Gozo was a Mallorcan knight called Juanoto Torres. The garrison of the fort consisted of 80 soldiers. Luigi Brolia was in charge of Fort St. Elmo. He was a Piedmontese knight and had as his lieutenant Juan Giacomo Parpea. The main garrison was composed of 80 soldiers under the command of Juan de la Cerda. A further 50 soldiers were sent to help them, as well as Juan de Guares, the bailiff of Negrepont, who was also in charge of all the reserves. The cavalier was manned by knights commanded by Geronimo Sagra and 50 soldiers. All the dependents of the order were commanded to hold themselves ready, as is their duty, with their horses and arms. The Grand Master's Spanish secretary, Esteban de Clermont, was put in charge of them. Throughout the siege, all civil and criminal actions were suspended by the Grand Master's orders. All civil prisoners were also freed so that they could take part in the defence. Despite the fact that commissioners had been appointed to ensure that the villagers brought all their cattle inside the fortifications, and despite orders and pleas on this score, the Maltese failed to do so. They thought the enemy would perhaps do as they did in 1551, when they attacked Malta but left after capturing a number of the inhabitants of Gozo. The Grand Master had done everything that he could to bring the island to a state of readiness, but he was still uneasy about the impending danger. We, who were about to endure the siege under his command, felt much the same as our noble commander. End of chapter 2.